Man, what are your opinions on the Confederate flag?
Absolutely. That's First Amendment right.
But it's of a piece with the kind of distortions and propaganda that are emanating from the oath in the Oval Office, the Manhattan Mussolini, the Tangerine Man, Agent Orange himself, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
Critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together.
This is a case of chickens coming home to roost. That is to say, it was inevitable that if you have a class of individuals like you do have in this country who give short shrift to every revolutionary process on planet Earth, except what happened in 1776, that's not a sustainable position. That's unsustainable.
They are not real people. It's a distortion. It's a lie.
I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there, I'm not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, in Dixieland where I was born in earth.
I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. Other people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. People slept on the floor. Out of here, out of there. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like looking no book.
But in any case, if the federal government is to be involved in the business of education, certainly it has a stake in people not learning false history and pseudo-history and history directly designed to undermine the foundations of the United States.
Absolutely. That's First Amendment right. I think that people are completely misinformed.
It needs to be a page one rewrite.
Absolutely true. I mean, someone could write a book about it.
I take it that he was making reference to his best-selling book, A People's History of the United States, which seeks to portray an alternative view of the United States of America. His view of 1776 basically helps to uplift those he considers at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who are rising up.
Right. I think that people are completely misinformed about how the flag was, like what the flag, like what it's, like how the war started. It's kind of evolved into like a racial thing when really it was not started as a racial thing at all. And I think that like it should absolutely be flown like publicly.
Any other opinions as far as agreeing with him or disagreeing with him? Okay, Mr. Justice.
People who are against the flag are against it for two reasons. The big one, the slavery racism thing, and the second, the lesser, it's a flag that represents treason. Arguably, two pretty good reasons to dislike it.
You do have a right to fly it. I do not think it should be flown on public property, like in front of a state house. You can also fly it at protests. But he mentioned misconceptions. There are no misconceptions about that flag.
See, what I'm stressing is that you guys are misinformed about the flag's like origins. You're saying that it's racist, but the flag is not a racist thing. It's been molded by our society to be looked at as a racist thing, when really it's not.
Okay,
Okay.
And if you want to go to the person who would have the best read on what the flag meant, how about the person who created the flag? And what he had to say was, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. If we ain't fighting to keep slavery, then what the hell are we fighting for? There is no question about what the Civil War was about.
I do not agree with that at all.
And your reason why he has a right to disagree.
And I probably wouldn't be
teaching you if the South would have won. I'd probably be chilling somewhere else.
All right. Can I have like 3 examples of what else the Civil War was about that was not slavery?
disagree, but
It was completely a war on northern aggression. North was making unconstitutional and unfair taxes on the South to promote northern manufacturers, because the South's main export was cotton. The Britain manufacturers were like doing better than the North, and so they were selling their goods cheaper here in the U.S. So the North had 5 times more population than the South, so all political votes would go in favor of the North, obviously. And so they voted to put a tariff, like the tariff of 1825 by John Quincy Adams. And that tariff put taxes and made promoted the northern industries while also degrading the southern economies, which is unfair. And they didn't want unconstitutional and unfair treatment, so that's why the South decided to leave.
So let's talk about it. In 1619, there were 20 human beings that were brought to America as slaves. 20. And it all started from that. Because what people figured out very quickly is, if you have free labor, the profits that you can make go up exponentially. The first slave ship is built in Massachusetts, not in the South. So this whole thing about, well, it was the bad South and the good North when it came to slavery. No, no, no. America went in all hands on deck. And I'm asking you to look at these laws because these laws will help you understand what slavery was about. What we have here is, we know the white slave owners will be raping the black women, but their kids are not going to be free. Let's make that clear right here and right now. We're going to steal their God from them, but even if they accept our God, they're still slaves. When you look at that one, and I think about policing in America today, it sends chills up and down my spine. And look at what you can get executed for. Growing your own food, learning to read, and assembling in groups. I remember talking to my great-grandmother, who was born to parents that were slaves. And I remember her saying, we had to be very careful not to show how smart we really were, because a smart black person was a threat. 40 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned other human beings. The founding fathers of America had absolutely, positively no problem with white supremacy. They believed in it. It was the truth. It was the reality of their time. And they weren't embarrassed to say it.
Most human beings I know are quite capable of denial and hypocrisy. And
Take it to day one. Say, yeah, these guys brought the slaves here. Hell, they even brought us here. Why are they allowed to be proud of their history? Why are they allowed to be proud of their flag? What does this flag mean to the Irish, to Indian people, to many African countries? Oh, sure, some might say colonialism was about commerce and not racism. Say, yeah, but racism sure helped.
One of the main reasons that Native Americans were driven off their ancestral land, the plantation owners had to have room. If you're going to grow cotton and tobacco, you need a lot of land. 13% of the entire American population was enslaved by 1860. Can I see a show of hands? How many people understood that slavery was that pervasive? And maybe some, and that's good, but you know what? I guarantee if you knew that, you didn't learn it in high school. And you didn't learn it in college. You learned that somewhere else. This is not taught to us.
And he said that the teachers are completely biased, and he told me the real story. And so do you think that what you've heard in the history classrooms at Shawnee Mission East are a little bit skewed from what really happened?
Okay, no, because like I asked you, and if you know.
But do you know what really happened?
If I know, I asked you to tell me what really happened. I asked you to that the Civil War started beside slavery, and you couldn't do it. You just looked at me. So please tell me the whole story.
I'll give a rundown again if you want. You want me to?
Yeah.
Oh God, here we go. All right, so
to understand the economic dependency on slavery. And so when I talk about the monuments and the Civil War and the things that are behind this, one of the other things I would just encourage you to do, like any other investigation that you would do, follow the money to understand what the motivation is. Just follow the money.
Northern manufacturers, right?
Go ahead.
All right, so Britain was selling their goods in America for lower prices than the North was, right?
Okay.
So the North had 5 times more population than the South. South's main exporter was cotton and tobacco. And so the South would make most of their money off shipping their cotton to Britain. And the North manufacturers, they made the tariff of 1825, which put a import and export tax on cotton, which would raise prices of northern goods, but it would hurt the southern economy because they would then tax the cotton that goes out to Britain. It was unconstitutional and unfair.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yes.
You said the 2 major crops were what?
Cotton and tobacco.
And how did they harvest them at a high level without prices being attached? Like, what was their main way of harvesting them?
Probably slavery. The cotton gin was.
How much did they pay the slaves? I'm just asking the question. I mean, if their main 2 crops were cotton and tobacco, and they used free labor, so they made a lot of profit off of it. This is just economics. Then how do you take out the fact that slavery was attached?
All right. Well, I have a question for Mr. Justice then.
You brought up an economics debate. Your argument was economics. If they made the majority of their profit off of free labor to be able to send out that cotton and that tobacco to everybody at a cheaper price and make a lot of profit because they don't have to pay the labor, then how can you detach the labor that did it?
People may think, well, I have an understanding that slavery was somehow directly tied to cotton production, and cotton production was kind of important. I want to ask you to think about that in some different terms. And before we do that, let's talk about Andrew Jackson, who was the architect of the Indian Removal Act. And our president, once again, we talk about rewriting history. You can't diss Andrew Jackson. King Cotton, the theory that was used by Southerners before the Civil War to say, we can do this. We can break away from the North and it's economically feasible. And here's why. Everybody depends on our cotton. We can shut down the mills in the North in a heartbeat. Britain and France are going to have to make a decision. Will they support us militarily? Because we can cut down their mills. We just won't send them our cotton. It couldn't have been more practically and beautifully stated than it was by Senator Henry Hammond of South Carolina. Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us, we could bring the whole world to our feet. What would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her, save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it, because cotton is king. Follow the money. This is how important cotton was. What kind of money are we talking about? 1840, cotton made 59% of all U.S. exports. This is 15 years before the Civil War. 1.5 million pounds with about 700,000 slaves, and you can see how that changed. 2.25 billion pounds and almost 4 million slaves. This is what made America wealthy. This was the formation of wealth. And folks, I just want to make sure as a side note to say, I hope you don't think that the money made from slavery just dissolved and went up into the air. It went into companies. and businesses, and not even tracing and blaming those corporations. Those corporations hired people and paid their salaries and their benefits and gave them the ability to raise families and to pass wealth on through the generations. This money is what made America financially stable. The market value of slaves in 1860 was greater than the market value of every railroad, factory, and bank combined. Follow the money, because the money we're talking about was huge. Think about the role of slaves and trade and slave labor in the economy. And that's a statistic that shocks me, because the Mississippi Valley today is one of the poorest places in America. And in 1860, more millionaires per capita than any other place in the country.
All right, I have another question for you. If you're going to say that the war was started on slavery, what percentage of white Southerners owned slaves?
And here's my other point.
That's 5%.
Diverting from the question.
5%.
Let me answer that. Now, the South was controlled by an elite of rich white people. The elite was trying to make themselves more powerful by pushing the Union into allowing them to move their slaves northward. Here's what they did. They tricked poor Southern whites into thinking they were fighting for freedom, when in reality they were being used as cannon fodder in a war that only benefited the rich people in the South.
Now, before we go into a historical rundown,
I offer you these laws to get you once again to think about what slavery actually meant, and especially the law from Oregon, which I don't have the adjectives for it. So, Texas school officials are saying we want our children to learn that slavery was a side issue to the Civil War because it's divisive. We have to look forward. And President Trump is saying we need to love each other now and whatever. But we need to love each other and we have to look forward, not backward. And I get that. Looking forward is important. But if you are looking forward from a place that is false, then where you're looking forward to is the road to hell. We can't go forward without acknowledging where we have been.
And this was the birth of institutionalized racism in America.
In my views, the Confederate flag it's a flag on, it's a you can't push me anymore, I'm gonna retaliate. It's like the Gadsden flag from the Revolutionary War. The North, I feel that the North was doing unfair things to the South, unconstitutional things, and the flag was a symbol of like, you can only push me so far before I retaliate.
and do you not feel that the current American flag represents that right for you?
Oh, it absolutely does, but the current American flag was also us seceding from Britain, or not seceding, but, so, I mean.
My question is, how many of us in here stand up under that flag and represent the United States of America flag?
I think all of us.
So, is there a need for another flag to be flown to unite us as a people?
And no refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave. That is your national anthem, our national anthem. And my point is that from Plymouth Rock, white supremacy was the basis of how this country was formed. It doesn't mean that we're not a great country. It doesn't mean that we currently are all bigots. It means this is the truth about how our country was formed, and we can either deal with it realistically and as the truth, or we can keep trying to deny it. And in terms of keep trying to deny the nature of our true history, I feel like just saying, how's that working out for us?
Groups and other hate groups were flying the Confederate flag, but they were also flying the American flag. So I don't think that that's a valid argument at all in terms of like evolving the Confederate flag into racism, because if that was the case, then the American flag would also be known as racist.
I think we're gonna let the professor speak once again.
Okay.
Maybe while we're on the subject of flags, we talk about what this flag means. We need to talk about our history in order to determine our future. Sure, this flag was more represented during Klan rallies, but it's not like this flag did much of anything to stop it. And the only reason segregation ended, which was approved in the Supreme Court, again under this flag, is because so many of these guys gave their life to end it. Maybe acknowledge the bravery of these people, and you will keep them on their heels. So
Do you know that when we left Britain to come over here, we took land from the American Indians?
Yeah, I do know that.
And do you know that also that the flag that we fly also kind of stands for hatred, and that we took land from other people, and that we've been living in a land that technically wasn't ours to take? So why are you only holding partial facts? Why are you only holding facts to the partial facts to the Southern flag when people fly this for freedom and they don't also fly it for people stealing from the Indians? You fly that flag every day for freedom, but we can't because it only stands for slavery in your mind.
So let's bring it. Why does this flag need to come down? Because it makes America uncomfortable about its past? Say good. It should be. It doesn't mean we have nothing to be proud of. The flag coming down will not change disparities of income, the economics, policing, the prison system. When people like this ignore overwhelming evidence of a culture of institutionalized racism, pretending that when the same thing happens to historically beat down people as if though it's some sort of complexion-based character flaw, don't be that asshole. Acknowledge it. Acknowledge the realities of this country. And shut up with that slavery ended 150 years ago bullshit and that argument that segregation ended 40 years ago. No one will listen to you bang on about your 4 years of heritage related to this flag if you're going to ignore 250 years of history. And if somebody smoked for 40 years and got cancer, quitting smoking.
I don't take my flag and go on Indian reservations and wave it around and be like, look what I stand for. I don't do that. Okay, I don't do that. What Drake does, and what all of you who wave the Confederate flag in front of any African American students at East, you're condoning that, and you're openly telling them that you accept the racism that they have faced and continue to face by you. I know all of you that make fun of the we too are East thing, all of you do that. I hear you do it. It is absurd. And for you to sit here and be like, it's okay because of states' rights and try to condone your own racist actions is absurd. Like, that is so ridiculous. And you can sit there and laugh at me, Drake, but you are being bigoted. And I think, like, the general American population that, like, is actually educated would agree with that. Maybe not all of us here at Shawnee Mission East that live in this bubble, but, like, I'm sorry that you're gonna continue.
If somebody smoked for 40 years and got cancer, quitting smoking does not cure the cancer. It needs to be treated. And we have not treated our cancer. We haven't even stopped smoking racism. Say, yeah, take down the flag, but it would be like painting a house that's on fire. We need to leave it up. If it means racism to the most of Americans, good. Let's leave it up until we actually deal with the issue. Until we make this flag mean what we pretend it means, that all men are created equal. We will still need reminders. Only an asshole can blame you for what happened before you were born. Just plead guilty anyway, but take it all the way back. Maybe start a campaign of education and dialogue as aggressive as previous generations spread hate under this flag.
It's not uniting. The Confederate flag wouldn't unite us as a people. I'm not saying yes or no to fly now, I'm saying neutral.
Yeah, no, it's good.
But you can still identify with it personally, your own personal opinions. When you fly that flag, you're not saying everyone around me, this is who we are. You're just saying, I believe in certain things about this flag,
and those things, I want to exemplify those to everybody else.
I'll go here and then I'll go there.
I mean, I agree with that. I think you have every right to identify with it, but I think it's extremely bigoted and hateful to do that when you are like aware of what it stands for. And you can claim that it stands for states' rights, but if you like took a history class, I assume you know that states' rights in the context of the Civil War were about slavery. Sure, they were about other things, but they were majority about slavery. You took a history class, you know that. You're choosing to be bigoted, and I don't understand that.
Every argument I've heard for keeping the flag has been stinky, stinky poo-poo. PR for this flag is fucking terrible.
The flag that we see today is not actually the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag is similar to that of the United States. It has a blue upper right-hand corner with 7 stars in a circle, 2 red stripes, and in the middle a white stripe. The flag we see today is an interpretation of a Confederate battle flag. And the interpretation went up in the 1960s around the time the Civil Rights Movement started. And to the point where it's not racially motivated. Then how come it's a symbol for so many groups like the KKK and the National Socialist Movement, who, as you all probably know, have white supremacist and neo-Nazi ideologies? Also, I find it ironic that people claim to be patriots when they fly that flag. The Confederates stabbed the Union in the back. They shot first, they murdered 500,000 American soldiers. And they argued that it was because of states' rights. I ask, states' rights to do what? What were we considering getting rid of at the time? Not guns, we weren't trying to raise taxes, it was slavery. We were trying to stop the expansion of slavery to the West. The Southern aristocracy panicked and left the Union. They said, we are not Americans, we are from the South, so we're starting our own country. And then they proceeded to launch numerous terrorist attacks against the Union, shooting at Fort Sumter, murdering 200 people in Lawrence, Kansas.
Okay, now Chris, great points. I want to give him a chance to return.
We just need a better argument. We need to plead guilty. Drop the bullshit, deny none of the charges. It sounds crazy, but hear me out, right?
And I don't understand that.
But let me handle one point at a time. Say we were fighting against a tyrannical government, the same thought process that led neither the North or the South to fly this flag, making this flag a treasonous thing against these guys. But we won, so yay us. And to Southerners, the flag demonstrates America's willingness to stand up to their government, making a rebel flag in many ways even more American than an American flag. Pretty good, huh? But that was the easy one. Now you jump straight in and start honestly talking about the horrors of Southern slavery. No one will expect it. Again, mention the racist constitution of that flag, that it explicitly says the white man is superior and should have the right to own black people. Don't go into this crap about how slavery wasn't that bad and it was about culture and commerce and all that. Just say yes, it is the flag of a racist would-be country if the South had won.
We were always taught that our ancestor didn't fight to protect slavery, he fought for Virginia. And what I want to do...
I'm going to let the professor speak once again.
Okay. Yes. Before the United States was what it is today, that did represent slavery and women not having the right to vote. But the thing is, we evolved. The United States has evolved over the years. Our founding fathers made it so we could change.
Think about this. George Washington owned slaves. He absolutely did. The Washington Monument, if you go to Washington, D.C. and look at it, it's got nothing to do with slavery or the Civil War on it anyway. I think what he was honored for was, I don't know, forming the country, being the first president. The fact that he owned slaves, you are absolutely right, and I'm going to talk about that. But that monument is not a monument to fighting, killing others, and being willing to die yourself so that you can enslave people and treat them as chattel. That's the difference between the Washington Monument and the Jefferson monuments and the monuments that I'm going to talk about.
In almost every town in South Carolina, there's a monument to the Confederacy. This speaks more to us than just of the lost cause and the romanticism attendant to that, like every lost cause. But rather in South Carolina, perhaps speaks even more eloquently to the tradition we have for inherited memory, passing down those constant truths from generation to generation, from father to son and mother to daughter, which I think has served us well in this state. Let the stranger who may in future times read this inscription recognize that these were men whom power could not corrupt, whom death could not terrify, whom defeat could not dishonor. And let their virtues plead for just judgment of the cause in which they perished.
And there is no question about the monuments to that war, because every person that is lionized in those monuments may have been brave, they may have been strong, they may have done incredible acts of courage on the battlefield, they killed other people, and maybe they gave their own lives, and they did it so that they could own other human beings like chattel.
When the Union was trying to change the way slaves were treated, the Confederacy, as I said, stabbed us in the back and murdered 500,000 people. And to your argument that the Confederate flag didn't start out as racist, I disagree.
And if you're wondering what the Civil War was about, how about not listening to pundits from today or politicians from today? How about going back and listening to the people that actually fought that war and what they have to say? If we ain't fighting to keep slavery, then what the hell are we fighting for? I got a couple of days ago an email from a gentleman who sent me an article about the Robert E. Lee family, because Robert E. Lee's descendants are still alive and in Virginia. And he said, I hope you understand that, you know, these descendants are not their ancestor. And I know you're going to give this talk, and I hope you will have in your mind and in your heart empathy, not sympathy, but empathy for his family today. And I want to say, could I just see a show of hands in this room? How many people in this room have ever owned a slave? I see no hands. Robert E. Lee's family, the people that exist today, they never owned slaves either. Slavery is not our fault. We have no responsibility for it. It is part of our shared history. And that's what we can't walk away from.
Here I am standing on the very same land where my ancestor had worked as a young preteen, and now that's heavy. It was something that brought tears to my eyes to say, my God, my God.
This is a case of chickens coming home to roost.
The boys were routinely whipped to force them to be more productive.
That happened while Jefferson was on Monticello. It happened when he was gone, because in the 18th century, you couldn't run a plantation without using violence.
The left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide Americans by race in the service of political power. By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen.
But in any case, if the federal government is to be involved in the business of education, certainly it has a stake in people not learning false history and pseudo-history, and history directly designed to undermine the foundations of the United States.
Whereas my work on 1776, which I dare say is reflected in the 1619 Project and also reflected in Ishmael Reed's work as well, aforementioned a few moments ago by myself, tends to focus on the fact that overwhelmingly, by several orders of magnitude, the Black population did not engage in class collaboration and side with their slave owners, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Patrick Henry, in fighting British rule in 1776. Instead, once again, overwhelmingly by several orders of magnitude, they tended to side with the British, the Redcoats. That was also manifested during the War of 1812, when the Black population joined the Redcoats in helping to sack and plunder and pillage Washington, D.C., sending James Madison, the U.S. president, and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the street, one step ahead of the posse, and then the Black population boards British vessels and sailed to Liberty in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, where their descendants continue to reside. And so that is part of the accurate and true history. I think that many of our friends on the left, they feel that it's important for the various sectors of the electorate to be on the same page. And so therefore we should have a similar view of the origins of this so-called republic. The problem with that particular approach is that it's not accurate. As I said, overwhelmingly, the black people did not support the founding of the United States, which is one of the reasons we face so much hell since then.
What are the specific reasons, whether they're misinformed or not, that they may feel offended?
Because South Heritage had slavery. I mean, that's a fact. That's probably why they're offended.
Wait, let him finish the conversation.
When the war wasn't about slavery, I can't help that history teachers are teaching that. I can't.
One of the most amazing books you will ever see. Written in 1839, Slavery as It Is. And the only thing these people did was to go to newspapers, cut out articles about slavery, and put them in a book. That's why they called it Slavery as It Is. And so I want to show you the real Andrew Jackson, because he had a slave that ran away, and he wasn't having that. So he put an ad in the newspaper, stop the runaway, and he offered a $50 reward. That's not what I want to talk to you about. It's the end of this newspaper advertisement put in by Andrew Jackson near Nashville, state of Tennessee. And this is what it says. If you find that slave, $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. When people say folks didn't fight the Civil War about slavery, they weren't about defending slavery. This is years before the Civil War. This is slavery as it is. Everyone knew that this is what slavery was about. There weren't any questions about it. He's on the $20 bill. And if he's on the $20 bill and he's a horrible, horrible person, what does that mean? Does that mean we have to take him off the $20 bill? Does that mean we have to start thinking about why we put him there in the first place? I don't want to deal with that. He's a great president. Well, these are the facts about Andrew Jackson that I'd ask you to consider. And that third one especially. And I want to give you a little bit more detail about that. But here's what our President of the United States has said about Andrew Jackson. And I'm going to read this. Had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart. And he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, there's no reason for this. The problem with it is, the first problem, that Andrew Jackson was dead 16 years before the Civil War started. And I know it is. It's like, are you kidding me? But it's like as funny as a heart attack, because there are people who believe this. And this is part, you're saying like, oh, it's ridiculous, nobody believes that. We are in 2017 and we're having a debate about what the Civil War meant. If you think that who controls the past is not important, you are wrong. Think about the arguments that we're having in this country today, and it's because the past has been concealed.
What do we say to people who say that they find the flag to be insulting? In what way does that stand? Like, in here, who finds does anybody in this room find the flag insulting?
Jefferson professed to hate slavery, called it an abominable crime, but he held on to his slaves. He freed only 7.
The author of the Declaration of Independence, who wrote that all men are created equal, owned 600 slaves over his lifetime.
And my question is, why are we so unwilling to listen? Why are we so unwilling to believe exactly what they're telling us? This is my favorite. All white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race as it existing in the states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. Do you think that they stopped believing this because the war was over? They are telling you as clearly as they can. At the South, and with our people, of course, slavery is the element of all value, and the destruction of that destroys all that is property. This is why we are willing to send our fathers and brothers and sons to make war on the North to try and separate our country. Because if we don't, you're taking away our very lifeblood. We need these slaves, and we are comfortable with it, and we thought you were too.
Is Thomas Jefferson any less great because the understanding we have of him now is three-dimensional?
Any way you look at it, race is going to get put on the back burner. So don't say nigger, just say states' rights. Remember that as we talk about our history, because that man learned from what we have done in the past. People think that the South lost the Civil War. They lost the war, but they won the peace. And they won it by rewriting the history of our country. And that's what I'd like to talk about this evening some.
Well, if we want to talk about how states' rights and how all this stuff, you want to have freedom in what you believe in, right?
Okay, like specifically though.
Specifically, okay. So not everyone is entitled to health care, but yet we think that everyone is entitled to health care. Not everyone is entitled to slavery because we got rid of that, right?
What?
Hold on. It's the same thing. Back in the South, Southerners thought that slavery was their right. Now we think that health care is our right.
So you're likening slavery to Obamacare?
Well, we're talking about we're talking about big government, and we're talking about states' rights. You can compare the two.
No one will expect you to be this forthright. So now here's where you hit them with the rope-a-dope. Ask them, should this flag come down because it represents a racist government? These liberal douchebags will predictably say yes. Yes, the South flag was based on racism, and this flag was based on all men were created equal. So this is a good flag. Well, this flag was written on a bad check. The all men created equal check, American people have not been able to cash. At least this flag was honest. Slavery existed under this flag too, actually a lot longer than it existed under this one. And the North isn't exactly a colorblind utopia today either. Just keep talking openly and honestly about history and racism in America. These BuzzFeed reading pussies might counter with the Nazi flag versus the German flag argument. They might say the Germans did up this one-off Nazi racism thing and put the old German flag on ice so now they can fly the German flag still, and that this flag was just used for a racist regime. Which coincidentally, both flags were designed by Germans. Totally unrelated. Okay, this flag wanted to end slavery, and this one didn't. The official policy of this flag, the good flag, until 1920, 40 years after the Civil War, was that these people needed to move, be re-educated, taught to be white, or taught to be dead. That seems kind of racist.
Okay. If we're the United States, then why do people fly the flag of a group of people that betrayed us and tried to leave? Secondly, we're not saying that you can't fly it. We're asking you to think before you do it and understand that people might be offended. And as you may say that you have the right to fly the Confederate flag, well, go ahead. We also have the right to burn it.
So we have our president saying the history and culture of our great country is being ripped apart by the removal of beautiful statues. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson. And it's so foolish, and also the beauty that is being taken out of our cities and towns will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced. I have an easy way for you to think about this.
Was that slavery was okay because they thought it was moral, but slavery was never moral. And so you linking someone to be able to go to the hospital and being able to afford their cancer treatment has nothing to do with slavery being okay back in the South.
And owning people.
Owning people will never be okay. And so I feel like when you say that you'll only take parts of the flag, of the Confederate flag, you forget that like it also acknowledges the fact that slavery is okay. And so I feel like if you say that someone's pushing you, like who exactly is pushing you? Just like
Although that did happen a lot. Again, deny nothing about how disgusting slavery was. Is this flag to these Americans what this flag is to these Americans? Or more accurately, is this flag to these Americans, and to these guys and some other guys? Talk about what this flag stood for generations after the Civil War. That how both flags have a racist history that we're trying to pretend away. This flag was also the flag of slavery. And for 100 years of segregation, this flag strictly limited immigration from non-white countries. This flag treated Nazi POWs better than Japanese and black American citizens during World War II. This flag overthrows democratically elected governments. This flag did whatever the hell this was. Now don't freak out. I love this flag.
This publication is put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I would encourage you to get it. You can get it online. It has amazing information about the monuments that have been erected in America and where they are and when they were put up. Those are the top 10 states with the most monuments. Come from their study. About 1,503 monuments, and they're still counting. They haven't gotten them all. 109 public schools, 80 counties, 9 official Confederate holidays, and 10 United States military bases. Can you imagine that at a United States of America military base housing U.S. soldiers that is named for a person whose glory came from being a traitor to the United States and killing U.S. soldiers? Why don't we have Osama bin Laden at the World Trade Center? That's the distribution in terms of Confederate states, border states, Union states, and then not a state during the Civil War. You can see where these monuments were built. And so if we're asking the question, why were these monuments built? One of the things that we want as we're thinking about the answer is, well, where were they built? Were they built in the North? Were they built in the West? Why were they only built in the South? And then we have this question. When were these monuments built? There were 2 spikes between the end of the 1800s and about 1921, and then essentially during the Civil Rights Movement. These monuments weren't built right after the Civil War. These monuments weren't built by people who were directly related to and lived with the people that died in the war. These monuments were built by folks who never knew the men that they were lionizing. 1900 to 1921. You see there, and you won't be able to see the date, but it's 1896. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. And the thing about that is, what I'd like people just to think about when I talk about how white supremacy is so ingrained in American culture that we don't even recognize it anymore. Plessy versus Ferguson was more than 30 years after the Civil War. And I told you the South may have lost the war, but they won the peace. Plessy versus Ferguson said the concept of white supremacy, it's not just the social construct anymore. It is the law of the United States, handed down by the highest court in the land. There is no other way to think about separate but equal. We weren't good enough to be in the same places as the white folks were. And you'll see later that Thurgood Marshall, when he argued Brown versus the board in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, part of his argument was this: separate versus equal was a concept that was derived to try and keep former slaves as close to that state as was humanly possible. Plessy versus Ferguson, the law of the United States.
And I think that integration for us meant freedom from oppression. I don't think that black people really thought of joining the country club or this or that. They thought, get rid of this humiliation. First of all, get some equal education for our children. That everybody knew. That was a goal. Get equal education because that's our future. But don't tell me I can't go to the bathroom anymore. Don't tell me I can't sit anywhere on the bus or in the theater. Don't tell me that. I don't, it's just too terrible. I don't think it was a positive thing. I just think it was get rid of all of this oppression. I mean, you cannot understand how horrible it was to have to contemplate a trip south. And the third thing was freedom from fear of being injured in the South. But a trip to the South for a Northerner was fraught with peril because you were worried that you run out of gas and some person would be violent to you and you have no recourse to the law because the law was totally unfair. And then once you got to the town where you were going to be, if you're wise, you had made arrangements to stay with friends because you couldn't stay at the local hotel. And there was often no public place to eat. Well, we want to be rid of all of that stuff. I think if I thought about it, I would have thought that white people's bad views of black people are based on ignorance. And when we get together, they will cease to be ignorant about us, and the scales will fall from their eyes, and they will begin to be decent. That's what I thought. I was pretty naive, but that's what I thought.
And if there is any doubt about it, and let me just say, there is absolutely nothing wrong with retail jobs. But when you have an economy that is based exclusively on the exploitation of free labor, this is what happens. We are now 150 years later. There is no industry in the South that has replaced the slave trade and what could be worked on by slaves. The mayor of New York City recommended that New York, not the state, the city, withdraw from the Union during the Civil War. Why was that? If you go and read, it's because we are making so much money from slavery, we want to keep doing it. If we withdraw, we can then be friends with the North, and we can be friends with the South. They are saying it to you as plainly and as directly as they can. And so the people today who say the folks honored in these monuments were not fighting for slavery, my response is, I understand that that's what you want to believe. And I understand how difficult it is to wrap your mind around the fact that human beings, fellow Americans, would fight, kill other people, and die to preserve slavery. It's really hard to wrap your mind around that. But that is the ugly truth. If you read that quote from Abraham Lincoln, I was raised to understand that Abraham Lincoln was my savior. I was taught that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves because he knew that slavery was an abomination. Abraham Lincoln said on many occasions, if I could preserve the Union and keep slavery, I'd do it. If getting rid of slavery is what it takes to preserve the Union, I'll do that too. What his goal was to preserve the Union. And I just want you to know that the debate about reparations for slavery is a completely false debate. First of all, go back to 1988 when Ronald Reagan was in office. Passed with almost no dissent was a bill giving $20,000 to every Japanese American family that was interned during World War II. That was absolutely appropriate. $20,000 doesn't even begin to compensate those families for what was taken from them, for what they lost, and for being essentially imprisoned for the term of World War II. At least it was some acknowledgement that what we did was wrong. If you talk about reparations for slavery, $20,000 for 4 years of internment, what is it for 256 years of slavery? And here is the kicker. Reparations were already paid because in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln set aside $1 million for DC slave owners to be compensated for loss of property. This is our history. We've already talked about the Indian Removal Act. In the middle of the Civil War, the government still was doing what white supremacy demands, which is favoring the white class over everyone else. And I'll give you a perspective on this that's interesting.
But fortunately, we later dealt with that problem. Oh, we never fix the problems. We only fix the things that are fine. Oh, one of the reasons American history is so important to me is I want us as a country to summon the courage to deal seriously with our problems. Sometimes I think that we're just so cowardly, like we're the cowardliest country on earth.
Oh, what about France?
If you guys are the type of people that get offended by me doing something, then I don't have control over that. I don't care if you burn the flag, because I just don't.
That's your right.
Yeah, I don't care. But if you're gonna really get mad about it,
he wasn't fighting for slavery. He was fighting for the South. It is the punishment of the South that its Robert Lees and Jefferson Davises will always be tall, handsome, and well-born. Their courage will be physical, not moral. Their leadership will be weak compliance with public opinion and never costly and unswerving revolt for justice and right. It is ridiculous to excuse Robert Lee as the most formidable agency this nation ever raised to make 4 million human beings chattel instead of men and women. Either he knew what slavery meant when he helped maim and murder thousands in its defense, or he did not. If he did not, he was a fool. If he did, Robert E. Lee was a traitor and a rebel, not a hero. I feel for the family of Robert E. Lee that's alive today, because this must be a really difficult time for them. This is the price you pay when you live a lie, when your view and understanding of history is based on a lie. Because when the truth comes to town, it really hurts when you're ripping that lie off. So, Anniston, Alabama, they decided that they wanted to honor this man, John Pelham. And that is a statue or a picture of the monument of Mr. Pelham in Anniston, Alabama. This is word for word from the United States Civil War website, not a Confederate website. This is something put up by our government. And this is what it says. John Pelham fought with such valor and dedication for the Confederacy, giving his life in that cause, that he has become a symbolic of Alabama fighting men in all wars who have offered themselves to defend the state, the nation, and the principles in which they believed. Those principles are simply one thing: white supremacy. He was a genius at killing the enemy. In the Battle of Fredericksburg, he kept the entire Union forces in disarray by himself, by firing artillery, running to the next piece of artillery, firing it, making the Union think that there were a large number of troops at their flank when they actually weren't. And it led Robert E. Lee to call him the gallant Pelham. This man died during the Civil War. He was an expert at killing the enemy, meaning American soldiers. And when you talk about the rhetoric that we have today about our military and about American soldiers and what we owe to the people who put their lives on the line, this man was slaughtering American soldiers. And they built a monument for him. Everybody remembers the Edmund Pettus Bridge and Bloody Sunday. Heck, they made a movie about it. But who was Edmund Pettus? Well, that's who Edmund Pettus was. The grand of the Alabama KKK. And that bridge was dedicated not in 1865 or 1870, but in 1940. And we'll come to that timing as we go through this, because the timing of these monuments, I think, suggests something that's very important in terms of understanding what they're about. This is one of my favorites, I will just tell you. If you have, can I see a show of hands? People here who have been to Stone Mountain, Georgia? So there are some people, and I'm glad to see that. But I'm betting you don't know the entire story of Stone Mountain, Georgia. Because on Thanksgiving Eve in 1915, William Joseph Simmons took these things to Stone Mountain, Georgia. He took bricks where he made an altar. He took the American flag. He took the Holy Bible. He took an unsheathed sword, and he took a cross. And he made himself the new imperial wizard of the KKK. That's what Stone Mountain, Georgia is. It is a monument to the KKK. Now, its history is interesting. That's what it looks like. It is the largest bas relief in the world. Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Conceived in 1912 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Deeded to the United Daughters in 1916. They started working on it with the KKK in 1922, but it was abandoned for 36 years until the state of Georgia purchased it and created the Stone Mountain Memorial Association to complete the project, and it was completed in 1972. So, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and what greets me as a citizen of Tennessee when I go to my state capital in Nashville, where my grandparents lived, this is what I see: Nathan Bedford Forrest. And you can see Confederate States Army, Lieutenant General, and his birth date and his death date. There is nothing else on this monument except the fact that he was a Confederate States General. Well, he made a fortune in Memphis as a slave trader, and he was the original Grand Wizard of the KKK. He led a Confederate massacre of black soldiers and white soldiers, American soldiers, during the Civil War. And this monument wasn't put up in 1865 or 1866 with people saying he's such a hero, we have to recognize him. This monument was built in 1970, 2 years after Martin Luther King was shot in the neck just down the road from Nashville, Tennessee.
I'm just afraid that I don't think you're understanding that they are personally affected, because I want to know that you know that they are and why they are. So I want to say that.
Why do you think
she asked a specific question, so he should answer the question?
Because they're misinformed about
Oh my God! You're the one who's misinformed.
The fact that this was normal, the fact that this was behavior that didn't really shock anybody, tells you something about how deeply white supremacy has been ingrained into American culture. Several years ago, I heard people on TV saying, this was one of the greatest movies ever made in the history of American film. And look at the advertisement, a stupendous motion picture employing the services of 18,000 people, accompanied by a symphony orchestra of 40. Film and art does give you an idea of where a country is and what a culture values. And this was one of the greatest hits of American culture at the time. How great? Well, it was 3 years in production. And many people don't know that this was the first movie that was ever filmed in the White House. Woodrow Wilson had this film shown in the White House. And the film, it didn't have any black actors, of course. They just put blackface on white actors to play the role of the evil black scourge. This is what President Woodrow Wilson had to say. The white man was housed by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. That is the President of the United States. And he is speaking to a populace in America that's saying, we get it.
Like, the purpose of this debate, I forgot who it was, someone said that, like, we're just sounding like broken records and we're just yelling all over each other. I don't think that's true. I think we're all pretty passionate about the subject, obviously, but I think that this is like a really good opportunity for a lot of you to think about it, at least. And I think that there's a lot of you in here that could stand to think about it, like on both sides. Like, it's obviously I don't think that you should not be allowed. I think you should be allowed to have it on your car or wherever you want. But I think, like, if you're going to make that decision, then I think you should be ready for the repercussions. And I think you should really think about, like, what kind of a person you're portraying yourself to be.
Drake. Okay, as Christopher said about burning the flag, you guys will get mad that I fly it, but I'm not going to get mad that you burn it, because I'm not the type of person to get offended.
One thing that people forget about our history is that Reconstruction after the Civil War was actually working. There were over 2,000 black elected officials in America. Businesses that blacks were starting to take hold. And in 1877, I think it was Grover, I can't remember the president, but he got elected and basically said, I'm withdrawing the troops. In 1876, there were 125,000 black registered voters in Louisiana. In 1878, that number dropped to 5,000. And if you're wondering about the flag, it had essentially been dead and buried until 1948, when Strom Thurmond brought it back with the Dixiecrat Party. And once again, they are telling us as clearly as they can what they are about and why they're waving that flag. The party's purpose was clear. We stand for segregation of the races. This is from the editor of the Augusta, Georgia Courier in 1951. Folks, they are saying it as plainly as they can. And yet we are still having a debate in this country about what this the Arlington National Cemetery. The vignettes include a slave following his young master, an officer kissing his infant child in the arms of her mammy. So Brown versus the board in 54, and we all, those of us of a certain age anyway, remember some of these images. And I told you about Thurgood Marshall's argument to the U.S. Supreme Court. And of course, when we think about the legacy of white supremacy, we recognize that public schools in America are more segregated today than they were in 1954. That's not by mistake. That's not by accident.
The early 50s, America was a horribly segregated country. It was as if the whole South was a rotten fruit that everybody could smell. There were a couple of notorious lynchings in Mississippi. A black kid named Emmett Till whistled at a white woman. They killed him. A black guy named Mac Charles Parker, who was accused of having raped a white woman, taken out of jail, killed, thrown in the river. I think both those guys were thrown in the river. Blacks were routinely pulled out of cars and beaten up by state troopers all throughout the South. Black poverty was just horrible. It was being shown in magazines. And then the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional for states to run segregated school systems. And little cute, clean, starched black kids began to show up on people's television screens, being walked to school by their parents and screamed at by white people. The contrast could not have been more stark. The white people who were screaming were, the caricature is the people, working class people, not terribly clean. Some of them obese, faces distorted with anger. Screaming obscenities at 6-7-year-old children. Well, television was new, everybody was glued to it. That was one. Two, the country had fought this fight for democracy. Blacks felt it, whites felt it, and blacks were restless. Sitting on the back of the bus, being relegated to the upper floor of a theater, and sometimes to only one row of the theater. Going to a gas station when your bladder was full and not knowing whether you'd be permitted to use the bathroom. Having white people be just as rude to you as they chose to be, giving you absolutely no respect. Not being able to try on clothes that you bought at stores. All of that stuff. And worse was going on. And Northerners knew it, and they had tried kind of to avoid it. But when blacks started taking their children to school, the North could no longer avoid the stinking, rotting fruit. And the South was represented by some of the most unattractive people in the Congress. Senator Theodore G. Bilbo of Mississippi was just an awful human being. And there were a lot of Southerners in the House who just spewed bile. And so the North couldn't see it anymore. And blacks began to get hope from the fact that the Supreme Court had finally said, and blacks interpreted this 54 decision to mean the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution include us. Just as we've always said, all God's children are equal. And so we started to move. And white people thought that's right, and a lot of white people joined in.
You sound like you're talking about sort of the continuation of the Civil War.
Understand that this is now 89 years after the Civil War. And this is the first time that the law in America, I'm not talking about the society and the social acceptance, but 89 years after the Civil War, it is the first time that the law in America says black folks are human enough that they can sit in the same classroom with us.
Segregation, and the legalized oppression of black people was a continuation by the white South of the Civil War. That's exactly what it was. It was taking out on black people their venom against the white Northerners and saying, you may think that you took our way of life away from us, but you're wrong and your foolish social theories are wrong too. So it was a continuation of the Civil War, there's no question about it.
I want to laugh when I read this, but what I remember is this is the tactic that was used by the South to rewrite history about what the Civil War meant. The reason they are doing it now is because it has worked in the past, and it will. Now we have this. And it's funny, except it's not. Our history is being stolen from us. Historical black universities and colleges, pioneers of school choice. Living proof that when more options are provided to students, they are afforded greater access and greater quality. And now the president is saying we're going to have to stop federal funding to these schools because that would be racist. And then this happened in 63. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and just a few weeks later, the Confederate flag was flying over the University of Alabama. And in September of 1963, these 4 girls got blown up in this church. When the terrorist shooting in Orlando happened, I was horrified by that carnage. And I thought, you know, I don't even have the adjectives to shooting in American history. Now, if you hear news reports about it today, most of them have been modified. And what they say is it's the largest mass shooting by one person in American history. Because what came to mind for me were these. Got blown up in this church. This was the young girl that survived. And if you want to see the faces of people who have directly experienced terrorism, you don't have to go to the 9/11 photographs. You don't have to go to the first World Trade Center bombing. You don't have to go to Oklahoma City. These are the faces of people watching the bodies being taken out of the church. You remember Ronald Reagan's campaign advisor? When Ronald Reagan was nominated for President of the United States, the first campaign speech that he made was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and it was about states' rights. And I guarantee you, the people in Philadelphia and Mississippi knew exactly what he was talking about. And then that's my hometown on April 4th. And I'd just like you to consider this. This is Dr. King in 1955. We must love our enemies, be good to them. This is what we must live by, and we must meet hate with love. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. This is Dr. King in 1967. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. Most of all, alienate it from society, and knowing society cherishes property above people, the rioters are shocking it by abusing property rights. That's not a speech that is brought out in Martin Luther King week either. And on the night he was killed, April 4th, 1968, he was writing a sermon that was found in the briefcase in his room at the Lorraine Motel. And this is the title of the sermon he was going to give 3 days later.
I think, honestly, I think like if you ever take a history class, they tell you that this part of our history is like a shameful part, and I think it should be left in the past because it's kind of irrelevant now.
I don't know if y'all remember the Traveling Wilburys. Great, great band. And one of their songs had this verse, and the walls came down all the way to hell, and I saw them when they're standing, and I saw them when they fell. Well, we have seen these monuments stand for way too long. And as I said, taking these monuments down will not feed a hungry person. It will not release anybody from jail. It will not solve the problems of race. But it is one way that we can at least begin to say we are going to deal honestly with what our past is, so that we at least have a fighting chance to move forward in a way that actually makes words like justice and equality mean something instead of sounding like a soundbite that makes us feel good.
So come on, family, we're all family. Let's get together and take a picture.
Shannon Lanier, right in front there, was 19 when he attended the controversial first ever combined Hemmings-Jefferson family reunion at Monticello in 1999. Afterward, he and Jane Feldman, the photographer who took this picture, traveled the country interviewing 4 generations of Hemmingses and Jeffersons for a book, Jefferson's Children.